Now let's take a look at transferring the attribute from one geometry to another. So let's create a geometry node and dive inside, and here let's create a grid. So here, as you can see, we have the grid, and let's also create a sphere. So here we have the sphere, and for the sphere let's set a color attribute by adding a color sop. Connect that, and let's change its color to red, and let's duplicate the color node and set its color to black. And now I want the sphere red color to be transferred onto the grid. So we can do that by adding a attribute transfer node. So attribute transfer has two inputs, so the geometry to transfer attributes to and the geometry to transfer attributes from. So set the display flag to the attribute transfer, and here you can define these attributes that you want to transfer. So if no attribute is selected, which means every attribute will be transferred. So let's uncheck the primitive, so because we don't have primitive attributes, and let's specify the attributes that we want to transfer. So click on the drop down menu and change this to color. So now if you go on to the condition, so here as you can see, we have transferred the red color from the sphere onto the grid. So before we have the grid colored black, and after the transferring, you see red color has been transferred. And we can narrow the area, so where we want to be attribute to be transferred. So if you go on to the attribute transfer into the condition, let's decrease the distance threshold to lower value. So here as you can see, so let's go on to the grid and let's increase its rows and column to add more geometry. So if we change this to smooth wire shaded, as you can see, we are adding more geometry. So let's change this rows and column to 100 by 100. Now if we set the display flag, now as you can see, we are transferring the attributes where our sphere is located in 3D space. So if we template our sphere, so if you hover over to that node and click on this template icon to template our sphere, so here as you can see, our sphere has been templated. So let's go on to the attribute transfer and let's lower the distance threshold until it matches with our sphere. Or maybe let's zero out the distance threshold and let's increase the blend width to create a more smoother fall off. Okay, so now if we move our sphere, as you can see, our color is moved as well, because we are transferring the attribute based on where the geometry is located relative to the grid in 3D space. Okay, so that's how you can transfer attribute from one geometry to another. So let's take a look at another example. So let's create a sphere. So let me untemplate the color node. So this is the sphere, and let's duplicate the sphere node one more time to create another sphere. So here on the primitive type, let's change this to polygon, and let's increase the frequency to add more divisions. And here let's create a attribute noise sub to create a noise attribute. So here as you can see, the attribute noise is noising up the CD attribute, and it is a vector. So let's change this to float, which means one value. So now as you can see, our noise has been visualized in black and white. So let's change this to smooth shaded again, and let's lower the element size. And now let's transfer this noise attribute to our original sphere. So go on to the sphere and let's initialize our first attribute, or maybe let's change the attribute from CD to extrude, because we are gonna use this attribute to drive our poly extrude node. So let's name this attribute to extrude. You can also use the CD attribute as well. So I'm using the extrude attribute. So let's here create an attribute create sub, and let's name this to extrusion or extrude. Okay, so now the extrude attribute has been created. If we go into the geometry spreadsheet, you see we have the extrude and the value is set to 0. And now let's transfer our noised extrude value onto our original sphere. So let's create an attribute transfer node, connect this to first input, and this will go into the second input. Set the display flag onto the attribute transfer. And so because we are going to use the poly extrude node, so this node, so because the poly extrude will extrude our primitives, so these primitive, so the attribute must be exist onto the primitive level. So if we middle click, now you see we have the extrude onto the point level. So let's change that. So select the attribute create and the class set to point. Let's change this to primitive, and here onto the attribute noise, the attribute class is point. Let's change this to primitive. And now if we middle click, now you see we have the primitive attribute extrude. So go into the attribute transfer, uncheck the point, and onto the primitive, let's select the extrude attribute. So we are transferring the extrude attribute. So we can visualize our extrude attribute by adding a color sub and connect that. And here the color type is set to constant. Let's change this to ramp from attribute, and our attribute exists on the primitive level. So here onto the class, let's change this from point to primitive, and from the drop down menu let's select the extrude. So here as you can see we have the extrude value visualized. So now let's connect the poly extrude node, and onto the poly extrude node go into the local control and turn on the local attribute distance scale, and our scale attribute name is, we set it to extrude. So let's change that extrude, and now this distance scale will act as a multiplier, so which means we need to increase it to have an extrusion, and divide into where it's a connected component. Let's change this to individual elements to be extrusion happen to the individual primitives. Okay, so let's go back onto the sphere, and maybe let's increase its rows and columns to create a more detailed geometry. And here onto the attribute transfer, go into the condition, and let's lower the distance threshold to 0, and let's increase the blend width. Okay, so now if we transform, let's add a transform node. So this is our noise attribute that we have created. So let's add a transform. Okay, so let's set the display flag to poly extrude, and if we move our sphere location, now as you can see we are adding an extrusion based on the location of our sphere. So maybe let's increase its scale a bit higher. Okay, and select the transform node and press enter to have access to its manipulator. So select the Y handle to move our sphere up and down. Okay, so now as you can see, we are extruding our geometry. So the extrusion is only happening where our attributes have a higher value. Okay, so we can go onto the attribute noise and let's uncheck the output raw value to create a more extreme extrusion. And you can also play around with the noise element size, and you can also animate the noise. So if I bring up my play bar and hit play, now as you can see, we are also animating our extrusion. So that's how you can transfer attribute.